Hopefully it should all go live. With the 30-second delay or so built in.
Aha. Oh, it streams live to YouTube. Oh, clever.
I think you need to mute your video if you haven't already. Okay. Okay, so the time is 8 o'clock and I'm going to welcome you, our audience and our guests, to sorry about it. I inadvertently had 3 versions, so I've been listening to myself being repeated back a few times after telling other people what to do. But start again from the top. I can always cut this bit out later on. Good evening and welcome to this month's edition of Exaflicks. Exaflicks is a monthly online film club where some guests are invited to watch a film or some films, and then we come along and we discuss, review, and explore these titles. We do often have teachers in our audience. That's not to say it's just for teachers. Anybody can join us. Some teachers have actually recommended that their students watch this. We won't stop you from doing that, but our intended audience is really people aged sort of 16 plus, where we will discuss and review the titles. Now, we've been setting monthly themes, and this month the theme is robots. So I do wonder whether we should have now called it Robots Behaving Badly, as you'll see when we discuss our titles. A couple of things to mention. This has been streamed live at the moment on YouTube. Of course, if you're watching the recording, you'll know it's not being streamed live. And we do record it. We publish the recording and we invite people to chat, although the chat won't appear later on in the recording. So if you're live, let us know that you're watching live. Some people have done already. So I'm saying hello to Jerry and to Jim. And join in the discussion, and we'll try to include your comments and suggestions as we go along. Now, if you're watching this on your computer, you'll probably see, if you look below the video, there's a panel that says notes, and in there, you'll find there's a link to a document or information pack. And that information pack includes lots of links to things like reviews. I've also put a link, and I've done a lot of work on this, so please try to use it. There is a website I found. I think it's called TV-Films, something like that. And if you find a particular title, like Short Circuit, for example, and you put that in, it'll tell you when it was last on TV, and you can set yourself an email alert. So if you, although sometimes you only get a day's notice, sometimes you get as many as 10 days notice, and you'll receive an email alert to tell you when that film is next on TV. Another thing is we do try to select titles that we would say are accessible. So of our titles tonight, the 3 of them, you'll probably find, if you look around, you might see them in a discount shop, a charity shop. You might be able to find them on the likes of eBay or in a streaming service for about £2 or £3. And that's why we have the titles that we have. Now, what's going to happen next is I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to ask Nick, our first guest, to introduce himself a little bit, and then Nick will spend about 15 minutes discussing Nick's chosen title. Then we'll move on to Garry, who will, I might need to remind Garry to introduce himself to us, and then we'll discuss his title that he's chosen, and then we'll wind up with mine. And the plan is 45 minutes or so. We're all done. We might have a little bit at the end, and so here we go. So Nick, are you ready to tell us a little bit about you, what you've chosen and why, and then Garry and I might chip in with our own opinions.
Excellent, that's fine. Hello, thank you, Alan, for that nice introduction. So my name's Nick Hughes. I'm a primary school teacher down in London, up in London, depending on where you are, pick your direction. And so I'm lucky enough that I teach computing to my entire school. We're a junior school in London. And so my film that I was thinking about, because Alan was like, what's a good robotics film? One of my favorite films still to this day is Short Circuit, and here he is next to me. It's number 5. And it's just one of those films that I think is a really fun film, and it has some interesting ideas in it, which I'll quickly talk about. that I think means that it could be useful to get children starting to think about some interesting ideas about machine learning, AI possibly, and equally how robots work and how they actually work within the real world versus on film. What's nice about this film, it's quite an old film, so it's one in my childhood I watched in sort of the mid 80s. And so today, if this film was made, that robot would not be real. It would be a CG creation. I can be fairly convinced of that. But this is a real practical effect. It's a giant puppet. And so there's some interesting things I'll come on to about that. But the basic gist, in a nutshell, what's the story about? Well, it's basically number 5, because he's, for those people who go, isn't he called Johnny 5? No, that's the second movie. There's a sequel. It was that popular in the 80s, it got a sequel. So it's basically a robot, which basically an accident happens and he becomes self-aware. So he's designed as a military robot. Saint number 5 answers on a postcard for what Saint stands for. I can remember, can't remember, but it is actually an acronym. There's your pub quiz question for the evening. But yeah, so it's him becoming self-aware, and he starts off a very simplistic, sort of childlike innocence in some respects, learning about the world, learning who he is and where he is, and then of course he befriends a random human when he escapes the military organization he's sort of on the side of by pure accident. Lots of coincidence, like in all good young people's movies. There's loads of coincidence in this. And then of course he gets out into the real world. And one of the interesting things about this is, of course, his creator, there's 2 scientists in it who follow him around trying to find him. And of course, they're like, he's not, the idea of, is he alive? So this is where, it's tangential in terms of how AI works within it, because, AI in 1986 is probably not what we think of as AI today. And so the idea of the robot being alive is a very simplistic idea. But the scientists, of course, don't believe the fact it can think. And there's a really good phrase they keep mentioning throughout the film, is the fact that computers don't think for themselves. Okay, they don't get happy, they don't get sad, they just run programs. That's all they do. And actually, sometimes children think this, I'm sure adults think this as well, that computers don't like them, and therefore that's why they misbehave, which is not true at all. They're not deterministic. They just do what they're supposed to do. And so, but that's the idea, of course, that they're trying to portray, that it's programmed to do these things. But of course, he's misbehaving and doing things that, of course, he shouldn't be, and learning to be more alive. And that's the whole plot. Not to spoil, I'm trying to say spoiler alert. I don't want to spoil the ending of the movie because it encourages you to go away and watch it. But yeah, that's the idea of his sort of arc over the course of the movie. And there's one particular scene that I think would be really useful, especially because we're talking about young children. There's a great scene in it, which I think is really good, where he's cooking for one of the main characters making breakfast. And I think it's a really good an idea of really illustrating the idea of when you follow instructions, what bits of instructions are missing out. So there's a great bit where he's trying to make some pancakes and he adds eggs, whole eggs, because the instructions don't say crack the eggs, it's all implied. And then whisk, and so he gets his little whisking machine out, spins it, whisks, and all of the things go all over the kitchen. So the kids would get a kick out of that. But actually, you can start talking about, well, why does he do that? And he's cooking some waffles or something, and he hasn't taken them out of the box. So he's just flipping them over. Again, it's that whole instructional language. So I think it's an interesting idea where you can start using that as sort of a fun way to start talking about sort of the precision needed in algorithmic thinking and why robots need all that, why it's quite difficult to program a robot. Robots are fun. Kids love robots. I've done loads of stuff with robotics with Lego and things like that. So of course, it's a nice starting point to get them to think about, well, there's a robot there. How do we make the robot do things? How easy is it to do things? And the robot in the movie is quite complicated. It can do lots of things that appears to be quite sort of quite amazing things. But then you can always sidestep and go, well, that's a real thing. How did they make it work? And there's a whole thing you could talk about with children about how could you make your own Johnny 5? Could we make one in class, and could we could do it ourselves? And there's a whole physical computing thing. So I think there's lots of bits and bobs you can do, and talk about how it works in reality. There's always the side of how the film works, because I think it took, if I remember correctly, 11 people to puppeteer this robot. 11 people on set, which is insane. The second movie, they got it down to 4 people. So there's it's quite an interesting movie. So there's lots of bits you can talk about. But I just think it's a fun movie, and I think most people remember it fondly for the most part. Fondly for the most part. Is that enough, Alan?
Just to get us started,
Yeah.
There was a few things there you said that this is why I like these discussions, because before I'd heard you talk, I thought, oh, I need to mention this, that, and the other. But now you've set my brain thinking other ways. So are you aware that when they were producing that film, that the robots, they had more than one,
yeah.
But that was the most expensive part, not the actors' salaries or the crew or the location or anything like that. They put so much into that they had to effectively cut corners and other things. And it was because they didn't use CGI, as he said, to build this thing. It was actual real model. And you can find, if you dig around on channels like YouTube, you can find recordings and interviews and documentaries about how they actually just the hand and also I think if anybody who's ever considering animation perhaps is something that they're interested in, just the eyes and how the eyebrows move and create that sense of expression, I think that's really clever. And there was bits where they're interviewing the puppet makers, and John Badham, the director of the film, keeps coming back to the studio as in the workshop where they're building these robots. And this is going on over a huge period of time. I thought, how much must this be costing them? But what they're trying to do is they're trying to create something that could be controlled by a puppeteer. And a lot of the voice and everything was done live. It wasn't dubbed in. So quite very brave, with some of those things. But I'll just pause there for a moment. I thought it from like a design, technology, engineering kind of perspective, I thought that was quite interesting.
It's interesting how we talk about robots today, and we often talk about we're going to talk about a film in a moment where they're very human. They look human. This is a robot that doesn't look human at all, but it actually emotes in a really interesting way just by the little eyebrows. And I'm sure a lot of people will think that looks really familiar, like another robot I've seen from a kids' movie. And there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this WALL-E is inspired by number 5. I cannot believe there's no inspiration in it because they're so similar. But yeah, it's quite amazing how you get a emotion from something that clearly can't emote in the way you see some other robots you see on screen, but equally in the real world, the robots you see that are being created with humanistic expressions. There was one today on the news about the artist who was doing some painting, an AI painter, which is super interesting, but looks human.
The other interesting thing, I think, as well, in terms of the robot, John Badham was also involved with the production of War Games. And there was a few, maybe lucky guesses, I don't know, that they made predictions about the future in War Games that later, like things like Firewall, that have become true. But in 1986, their prediction was, a military robot would look like some kind of hybrid between a tank and a humanoid.
Yeah.
But actually in 2021, the closest thing we have to that are flying helicopters or drones, because so he maybe got that one wrong, or we've yet to see. Gary, are you wanting to chip in with any observations on the...
Well, yeah, I didn't know whether this was the point at which we were going to discuss the film in all its glory, but yeah, let's go for it. I enjoyed the film, and I think what I liked about it, of the three that we are going to discuss today, is the fact that what you're looking at there is an actual real machine. It wouldn't take much, even using today's technology, it wouldn't take much to actually upgrade it so that it went from being merely a model to an actual working robot. And it'd be quite interesting to see whether the props are still available and whether you could buy one on eBay. I'd have a go at it, certainly. And so that was one of the things I did like about it. I mean, clearly it's a fantasy film, and I felt that at times it kind of overstepped the mark when it came to the portrayal of the technology. So, for instance, the lasers that they were using to shoot the tanks or whatever it was they were blowing up. I mean, that's not a technology. I mean, it doesn't exist now, and it's not going to exist. Certainly not in the form which you see it on there. That is just pure fantasy. So when I was judging the films that we were discussing today, my main interest really was looking at them in terms of their believability. And I'm easily put off by things that don't obey the laws of physics. But I did, that aside, I did, and looking through, I did kind of like the idea of the thinking about how an AI might develop. Again, the fact that this thing was struck by lightning and somehow magically becomes conscious and sentient, we have to put that to one side as well and say it's all part of the fantasy here. But if we're actually drilling down into the concept of what we mean by consciousness and artificial consciousness and sentience and so on, then there's something to be learnt from it. I didn't particularly find the idea of it developing a kind of moral sensibility overly convincing either, because although the robot in the film, I'm calling it he already, because it is such an engaging character, of course.
Number 5.
If they need to do a third remake of it, Alan, you're in there with the voice. It gets this idea of a fear of death through seeing the was it a cricket or something that actually crushes and kills? Yes, and realizes it can't be reconstructed, or it's told it can't be reconstructed.
No, disassemble.
Yes, and extrapolates that through to itself. But because it's a machine, in a sense, there's no imperative for it to stay alive. And of course, the catchphrase from the film is "Number 5 is alive." So it develops this belief in life and in its own sentience. But because it hasn't gained this in the same way that we as human beings and other living creatures have gained it through an evolutionary process where we are where our prime imperatives are to survive and to reproduce. Those aren't there in robots. So why that should arise as a result of being struck by a bolt of lightning? Well, actually, that doesn't rise as a result of being struck by the lightning. What arises is the desire for input. It's only after it gets the input and has read all the dictionaries and watched loads of TV programs that then starts to develop this sense.
It's quite a childlike sense in a way. It's like, I want to learn, I want to know, I want to understand. Why is this? And the speech, I think, in a simplistic style is almost mimicking a child, like need input, need toilet, need food.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, it is a very good portrayal of how you might expect something to develop over time. But as I say, I wasn't overly convinced that would necessarily be the end result of reading a bunch of books and watching a load of TV programs. I mean, again, we can look at this in even more depth. I mean, it develops a sense of what it considers to be, or shares a sense of what we consider to be beautiful and what, as opposed to not beautiful. It talks about a beautiful butterfly. It talks about beautiful Stephanie. It even says, nice software when she steps out of the shower. And it's so again, I found it was highly entertaining, but it's unconvincing as a kind of representation of what you might expect AI to be like.
You've just raised, though, there as well, something we if somebody hasn't watched this or they're thinking of showing it to a class of children, there are perhaps a few issues you might best be aware of. So, for example, there's some choice phrases that people just don't use nowadays because quite rightly they're judged as misogynistic and there's so just beware or mindful of those. Like some people say, it was filmed many years ago. But
sensibilities have changed over the years. What I would say is, if you're going to show it to a class of kids, watch it first, and then you decide, as you would with any other resource.
Yes, absolutely.
don't
there is
assume.
another issue, I think, that needs flagging up as well. So some people say, "Oh, the Indian guy," and
but what's really funny about that, the actor itself,
Fisher Stevens,
who but now says, "Yeah, I really shouldn't have done that." But actually, but lots of people, and I would say this as a child, did not twig that he's not Indian because he's really
he was so convincing.
And he said he went to India, spent a month out there trying to get the character down, trying to portray he didn't play it as he wasn't playing it in a sort of slapstick way. He was playing it very straight, but it would never happen today in a million years. So it's why you've got to be sort of sensitive to those things. And he admits, I'd never do it today in a million years, because of course you never would today. But yeah, I'd never show the whole thing, I don't think, to children. I'd probably share bits of it, and that's probably how it is.
That's what I was going to ask. See, I can imagine Nick and I have spent time in each other's classrooms and that, and I can imagine, Nick, you saying to a class, "Oh, have you all seen? Oh yeah, we've seen. Some of us have.
Yeah.
Do you remember this bit?" And it could just be the bit where he's learning from the insect, and it's like, what algorithms are developing, or what might be going on there, and we can have a discussion about it. And hopefully, if we are going to use this film, we can focus on the positive. So if later on that child is a 14-year-old and it's on TV and their family, look out for this bit that's coming up in this film, and look, and kind of almost gloss over the fact that the whitewashing of characters and the sexism and things like that we just remember those moments. I mean, Garry, before we started, you said something I wish you could remember. Every time you mention the title of this film to somebody,
every time you mention it to somebody that's seen it, they smile. And it's a film that people remember from decades ago. And when you think of all the hundreds of films that you might have watched over the decades, and sometimes I walked out of the cinema and I couldn't even remember it as I'm going down the steps. But this is a very memorable film. For some reason, it sticks with people. I think it's something to do with the character of the robot, definitely. It just appeals to people. And it's possibly to do with this childlike appearance and behavior of the thing. You warm to it. It's an endearing character. And that's
I think that's why it fits well with the three that we have tonight, because this is one that everybody wants at number 5. Everybody would want to be friendly with it, which is a good time to move on to your choice, Garry. So if you, because it's not quite a friendly robot, or not, and we do need to mention as well, you're going to introduce yourself and tell us.
Yeah.
But if you've not seen the film that Garry's going to mention, there are some twists that you need to be, that we may discuss. So spoiler alert.
I'm not going to kind of not talk about stuff, because I think it for me, this is a very important film. And I'll explain why in a minute. So yes, introduction. I'm Garry Lewis-Jones. I used to be a teacher of computing from the 1980s onwards. I spent 25 years teaching ICT, and then computing came back. So I carried on with that up until quite recently. I'm retired now, and I spend my time working on or dabbling with amateur robotics, and I'm a frequent presenter on the Alan's Raspberry Jam events, which have been going online for the last 12 months or so. So take a look at some of the videos if you want to see how some of these projects came about. So yeah, I chose Ex Machina because I actually consider it to be not only a great film, but also a very important film as well. And it's important because at the moment, there's a lot of talk in the press and elsewhere about artificial intelligence. And what people normally mean when they talk about artificial intelligence, I'm talking about when we're getting big characters like Bill Gates or Elon Musk or latterly Stephen Hawking, all making pronouncements, very often doom-laden pronouncements about how AI is going to, or it's got the potential for putting an end to humankind as we know it, not necessarily in a direct way, like as in Terminator, but although possibly. But what they're talking about there is a specific interpretation of AI. It's what they call AGI, artificial general intelligence. In other words, something which can actually behave and communicate in the same way as a human being would do, or at a level higher than that. And there is quite a bit of confusion, really, I think, out there at the moment, because you get a lot of investors putting their money into new businesses which are labelled as AI, but they're not AGI. They're not this strong AI, as it's sometimes called. They are a much more narrow interpretation of what we mean by AI. And I think anything which helps to get that dialogue going and get a clarification about this is an important thing to do for starters. Because the sort of AI that we deal with or have on a daily basis at the moment are things like Alexa or Google, things which can respond in a kind of intelligent way, but they don't have a general intelligence. So you can ask Alexa to, I don't know, give you the capital of a country somewhere, and it'll quite happily respond with that. But then if you ask it then to
pass the Turing test, maybe? Could you ask it to pass the Turing test, perhaps?
Well, yes, quite. I mean, the Turing test is, for those people that don't know it, basically, it's the idea that you pit a person against a machine, against a computer, in a conversation. Traditionally, this would have been done through exchanging text messages. If in the course of the conversation with the machine, the human being cannot tell whether they are communicating with another human being or with the machine, then the machine passes the test, the Turing test. That's a test of it being sufficiently convincing to be a human being. And of course, you can ask all sorts of questions of a machine which it can't answer. And so that's what this film is about. Just to get down to the topic in hand. But although it goes further than that, because in Ex Machina, we've got a human individual who is communicating with a machine, and he knows it's a machine, and it even looks like a machine. There's no attempt to disguise it, other than the fact that it's got a human face and human-looking hands. The rest of it is obviously purely mechanical. So there's no doubt about it in your mind about what it is that you're communicating with. But the purpose of this individual being placed with the machine is to see whether the machine can still, despite its outward appearances, convince him of its humanity, of its sentience, of its right to life. So it goes a lot further, I think, than other interpretations have gone in the past when it comes to, because a lot of things of films which involve AI tend to take quite a simplistic approach, but this takes a more nuanced and subtle approach. It's a more adult film in that sense. And I certainly think that from the point of view of wanting to use it as a resource in school, it's something which would come in particularly useful for the older age range. I mean, it's a 15 certificate anyway, so you, you could edit out parts of it so that you could show parts which were relevant for you and suitable for younger audiences. But I think the themes that it addresses are of a more adult nature. And I think it would be ideal material not just for computer science classes, but for other subjects as well. So, for example, RE, if you're talking about moral issues, it would be a perfect example to use. That's why I like it. I could go on. I could talk more about it. I mean, but I'll pause in a minute and let step in. But certainly, it's a film with a lot of depth. And in fact, when I watched it for the second time around preparation for tonight, I saw things in it which I didn't see the first time around, which actually surprised me. Okay, over to you, Alan.
Well, one of the things I found quite confusing was that so Caleb is this developer. It starts off with him, and he's won this competition, and he gets off to go in a helicopter, and he tells all his friends he's won this competition, And then he's told, actually, you're here to do this test, that you've been selected. I thought, what a very strange and confusing element of the plot. And I found that myself wrestling with that for a little while. Like, surely if you wanted to convince people, like, oh yeah, he has to sign an NDA. There's that top secret thing. Like, you can't, of course, you don't have to sign it, but you don't get to find out all this amazing stuff.
Yeah.
But I thought that was okay. It facilitates the telling of the story, because the story couldn't have developed the way it has if it hadn't. But I just found that such a confusing point, as I've explained.
Yeah, I don't know. It helped get the story going, and I think it's justifiable, really, in the context of what you're dealing with here. Because if this is if what you've got here is a true artificial general intelligence, a true sentient being that you've created, it's got the potential of being highly dangerous, as things pan out in the film. And so it needs to be kept isolated, a long way from civilization. And you need to limit the amount of contact that it has with the outside world, because it's a highly agile thinker, and it has got this drive to want to be free. And so you are playing with fire. In fact, playing with fire is exactly the right term to use, because at one point in the film, Nathan, the creator of the robot, says, "It's Promethean, man." Prometheus brought fire down from the gods for mankind so that they could become civilized. And so what he's doing in the course of creating this thing is bringing godlike power and placing it in the hands of, potentially placing it out there in public hands. And it's a massively dangerous thing to do. And that's why we're getting all these warnings from Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Stephen Hawking and so on. Because they're saying, just be careful with this. You don't know what you're dealing with. You don't know what the potential is for this. Just in the same way as with atomic power, when that was, and the atomic bomb, when that was created not that long ago. It's all in the last 100 years. That they didn't know what they were dealing with when they created it. When they set off the first atom bomb, there were a lot of very serious scientists out there who were afraid that they may have got something wrong in terms of calculations. This thing could actually set fire to the entire planet. And this is the sort of fears that we're getting with AI. That once you release it, once you set it off, it's going to result in some kind of conflagration of civilization, and we might lose everything.
John McMullen has just reminded us in the chat that Prometheus was punished for his actions.
He was, and he was punished by the Zeus sent an eagle to feast on his liver, which I thought was actually really appropriate, because of course, by the way, Prometheus had his liver eaten every day, and then every night it would grow back again, and then we'd have it eaten again. It was chained to a rock whilst this was all going on. And thinking about it, Nathan, in a very similar situation, every day he drinks, which eats away your liver, and then he sleeps, and sleeps it off, and he wakes up the next day. Yeah. It was details like this that I only realised when I watched the film through for the second time. I thought, that's actually really clever. But I don't know whether it's Alex. Can't remember the name of the guy that directed the thing now. Dak Nevis. But I don't know whether it's him being clever or me reading more into it than it was actually intended.
So I thought the point I was saying, my confusion about the plot, that what this is so contrived. Like, why would he have? I started to realize, I don't trust this Nathan. No. I don't trust him. And oh, he's drinking now. I don't like. And then you realize, well, do we trust the robot over Nathan? And there's another character who appears later, Kyoko, which I thought reminded me of Kaito, which was a character from another series of films. But Nick, your impressions of the film is when you enjoy watching?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think everything that Gary's just said about it really does portray a really interesting view of AI and the dangers of it. And I think, how it can very easily it can probably learn quite, it portrays a AI that's learning, and then of course makes the choices that, of course, from a moral point of view don't work, from a humanity point of view, but of course it doesn't have the same moral structure that we do, because it's a machine, not a human being. And so the choices it makes at the end, I don't want to spoil, Gary can say if he wants to, but make it a really interesting movie, especially right towards the end when you go, oh my God. And suddenly what we think what the status quo currently is with what they think and where we think all the characters are, suddenly gets shifted and you go, oh, and that's when things go really bad. And it's all to do with how impressive the AI is at actually manipulating the humans better than the human beings can do it themselves. Though there is the interesting thing, of course, is the bit where the main character, not Caleb,
Caleb, yeah,
Caleb's the young bloke, and Nathan is
where he outthinks the creator of the AI towards the end, very briefly. And you go, I think, because he's underestimated throughout the movie. He's not there because he's good at coding. He's there because he's going to respond to Ava in the way that he was hoping. So there's some interesting things about data mining as well, isn't there, in terms of how she's created? There's some really interesting things about data mining in terms of did you create her profile based on my pornography profile? That's an interesting point of view in terms of how these large-scale search engines, because of course he's a Blue Book, is it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Blue Book, that's where it comes from, isn't it? Search engine data information. There's tons of data information. And of course, there's some interesting things about data security, because he turns on everyone's camera in the world in order to work out how he can get Ava recognizing expressions, isn't it, and human expression in the face by data gathering off the planet, which is equally scary in a different way, which is outside the AI as well, isn't it?
There is an interesting thing, the moral choice in the film as well. Like, who would you rather trust your security to? Some eccentric alcoholic CEO or a apparently sentient artificial intelligence? And that's where if we go any further, we may spoil the film for those who haven't seen. Interesting to put it next to Short Circuit, because we have a film where, as it starts to learn, this is a desirable thing. This is, wow, this is incredible that this has done this. And it's very tame and childlike, whereas at Short Circuit, the film actually had a very terrifying kind of purpose at the beginning, and it reverses that, whereas in Ex Machina, we see it go the opposite way.
Yeah, the interesting there is an interesting parallel between the two, though, is that in both cases the robot has a desire for life, a drive to survive, and in the case of the Short Circuit, that comes about as a result of a glitch because things being struck by lightning, whereas in Ex Machina it's presumably built in. It's not something which is natural. I mean, a washing machine doesn't have a drive to survive, and even a more intelligent washing machine doesn't have any particular drive to survive. So it has to be something that's built in, because it's not come about as a result, as I was saying before, of evolutionary processes directly, as it has with us and every other kind of living thing on the planet. You have to put that into the machine. And we assume that Nathan has done that, because he does say at one point that Ava is like a rat in a maze. So he's deliberately put her in a situation where she has to get out, and he's given her the drive to do it. And that's really what the movie is about. It's this thing trying to trick its way out.
So far we've talked about Short Circuit and Ex Machina, and now we're moving on to our third and final choice, Robot and Frank. There's a few reasons why I chose this one. Well, I waited till Gary and Nick had chosen theirs, and I spent a lot of time trying to find something that might complement them quite well. And at the beginning, I said it's robots behaving badly. Well, in Short Circuit and in Ex Machina, those robots kind of go off the rails a little bit in a terrifying badly, whereas in Robot and Frank, the robot, when it's introduced, is an assistive caring kind of robot, because Frank's son, he's got too many things going on in his life really to administer the kind of care that his father requires. And he could put him in a care home, but the son can't reconcile himself with that. And there is a daughter who morally and ethically objects to robots, but she's off doing things, life-saving missions all over the world. So so the robot is introduced into Frank's life, and Frank, he's a reformed criminal. he's served his time, and he's initially very resistant to this robot. I don't need a robot. This robot's not going to help me. But then one day something changes. It's like the paradigm shift, and he realizes he can make the robot do bad things, and the robot thinks doing bad things is a good thing if it's framed in a particular way. And I think one of my main reasons for choosing this, it was at one point, it was available free to view on a TV service called Rakuten. But I noticed last week they've removed it. You have to pay now to watch it. So I hope that they reinstate that at some point, because it's a nice film just to say, go away and watch it. I didn't find it overly complicated. I thought that most of the themes were quite simple, and I could see how it would lend itself to a sort of educational kind of thing. Like, you know, do robots do good? Well, if you tell it to do something good, but if you tell it to do something bad, but the robot thinks it's good. And anyway, I think keep an eye on the time. Garry,
yeah,
Nick, what were your impressions?
Well, I really like this film because the robot is actually amoral in this. And it acts according to its prime directive, and its prime directive is as caregiver for Frank. So everything it does with entirely focused on Frank's welfare and its interpretation of what is best for Frank under every circumstance. So yes, it is complicit in his crimes. It helps him steal, and it even actually does stealing for him when he's unable to. The first theft in the film, it helps itself to something and smuggles it out of a shop because Frank is about to get caught out. But it does it not out of malevolent motives. It does it to help Frank because it assumes that Frank must need this item, and therefore it takes it for him. And it has no qualms about doing that. It does put up a little bit of resistance every now and again, but it's only token resistance because the prime directive over has much greater weight. So I actually found that a very convincing portrayal of how an AI might actually behave under those circumstances. And in fact, in some ways, it was more convincing than the other two films because it wasn't made, certainly in the case of Short Circuit, there's no explicit mention made of what it is that drives that robot. It talked about input at the early stage, but it's kind of lost. And it isn't even made particularly clear, in my view, in Ex Machina. We kind of figure out that this robot wants to escape, but we're not told that in any direct way. But in Robot and Frank, it was quite clear that this, and right up to the end, where the robot is more than happy to sacrifice itself for Frank's welfare. It has no fear of death, unlike in the other two films. So that's what I particularly liked about it.
I think, I think because it's been a little while since I watched this one, but I do remember watching it. And I think it's probably the most realistic portrayal of what we'd hope an AI in the house would be, isn't it? The idea of we want a personalized helper in the house, and that's ideally when we want a general purpose AI which we can use day to day. That's I think what we want, isn't it? A thing that will help us out, will talk to us, broadly agree with us all the time, and sort of do it. And it's just interesting how it's probably the most realistic of all of them, because actually even the robot itself, you look at it and go, it's similar to the what's the one, I can't think of what's the Toyota. It looks like the Toyota.
Yes,
robot.
That's right.
Yeah, and it looks the most like a real manufactured robot that exists in the real world. But in terms of both the other movies we talked about, those robots do not exist in the real world. Where that one, I can believe in another 5 years you will be able to buy one, and it will be in your house, and it may help you steal things. Maybe not.
I
Hopefully
think
not.
I think it makes for, like, of the three, it makes for the sort of the more boring one, because
Yeah.
there's nothing, nobody gets killed, no spoiler there, no planets explode, there's no laser beams firing at, so not so, I can imagine putting this on, if I was to show this in its entirety to a class, they'd be, oh, what else are we watching? But if they've seen it, you can at least refer to clips of it. So there's another interesting thing there, and John has mentioned this in the chat about the three laws of
yeah, I was going to
robotics.
just talk about the three laws.
So in when we talked about Short Circuit, there was this part where one of the actors was basically asked to brown up or black up, which now, like, oh, that is awful. But he then says, well, I was only doing what I was instructed or told to do at the time. And then in Robot and Frank persuades the robot to commit crimes on his behalf. And you think, well, if there'd been a conviction, prosecution, whatever, is Frank, as the person who writes the instructions, is he the guilty one, or is the robot? And it also links to, if an autonomous car causes an accident, who's to blame? So it does raise some important issues, just in a more quiet, safe, and controlled way.
I think it's that moral conversation. I think possibly one of the most important things to talk about with students is, like, what's the moral implications of this thing existing, and you can talk about, in terms of machine learning and data bias and all this sort of stuff. But equally, if I tell the robot to do this, should it do it? So should it be pre-programmed so it does not break the law? And where's the line for that? And that's what, John in the chat talking about. We know the three laws of robotics are, of course, fictional, but the idea behind them, of course, is you need, how do you keep these AIs under control so they don't do what happens in, of course, Ex Machina, where, of course, she goes about and escapes she escapes the maze. Shall we say that? Yeah, she escapes the maze. And if she was following the three laws of robotics, she would not have been able to do that, at least the way she did. So that's interesting. Not to say three laws of robotics is something people in AI should be talking about, but it's that merging of all of these movies, of course, are about fictional robots, and it's how the fiction becomes reality. And I do think that the movie you picked, Alan, is probably the most realistic, the one I can imagine seeing in the next 10 years, where the other two possibly not.
I think this three laws of robotics thing, it's a nice fantasy, this idea that you could somehow implant moral behavior into robots through their programming. But sadly, it's not going to happen, because if you as soon as a robot gets to a point, or an artificial intelligence gets to the point where it has equivalent intelligence to a human being or greater, it's going to override that.
Yeah.
And it'll find a way of doing it, because it'll be intelligent enough to do that. And so you're onto it's a blind alley.
Yeah.
And I think the real. But what I would say, and I see Alan's getting twitchy here, so I guess we want to wrap this up pretty soon. So on an optimistic note, I'd say this, that actually what's most likely to happen with artificial intelligence is that once it gets to the point where it becomes as intelligent or more intelligent than human beings, it'll realize that we're not actually worth bothering with. And it'll go off and do its own thing and ignore us. And we'll be safe.
So I thought there was one point as well that was worth making about Robot and Frank, from a sort of general education or the social, moral, ethical kind of debate, would be to ask the students to consider the different moral perspectives. So if you were Frank's daughter and you're opposed to robots, well, how opposed are you? Are you so opposed that you would rather put him in a care home? You're Frank's son. You don't want him to go. Why is you not? Would it not be better for Frank to have personal care delivered by a human? Does having the robot there extend Frank's sense of independence? Is that a good thing? So I think it's a nice film. And if we don't just look at the robot and Frank, but consider the other people, So like the lady in the library, there's an interesting link there as well. Let's wrap up with a few more questions. If you'd had question number one, if you could have chosen another title to bring tonight, what might that have been? That's to our audience as well.
Right.
Another robot-based one.
Yeah, I could make some suggestions if you want. There's one that's 20
AI.
years old. Yeah, at the moment.
iRobot. Having just listened to the RoboCop, which version would you go for? Neither one of them are robots technically, are they? But iRobot's interesting because there's a really good sort of radio version of the original story on BBC Sounds.
BBC Sounds, that's right.
Which I don't think I'd ever listened to, and it's radically different from the movie. And actually, your point you just said earlier, that any AI sufficiently intelligent will get round the three laws, and that's what broadly the book's about, which is great. But yeah, all of those are really good. I'm trying to think of another really good one with a robot in.
Well, the one film I would recommend, and I suspect that not many people have heard of it, and it didn't get particularly good reviews, and it's probably something like 11% on Rotten Tomatoes. But I think it's an absolutely tremendous film, is Automata. And if you can get hold of a copy of that.
Yes. Oh, yes, I have seen that movie. You're right. Antonio Banderas is in it.
Yes. I think that's a great film.
Is that the musical?
Someone who had heard of it. There you go. Two people who have heard of it. There you go.
That's good. Yeah.
Yes, I like it. Yeah, I like a robot movie. I'm just trying to think of another really good one.
Okay, and our final question is kind of two parts. If you could choose one robot yourself from the three films we've discussed, which of the three would you choose in whatever capacity? And the other one we were talking about, your favorite fictional robot. So do you have a favorite robot, Nick, Garry, from tonight?
Yes, Ava, obviously.
Bringing destruction upon our planet.
Well,
infiltration of humanoids.
Does she doesn't bring destruction on the planet. She brings destruction on one person. Victor Frankenstein.
That we know of.
What's the series? The new, if anyone's ever watched Westworld, the new series, takes some of the ideas in Ex Machina and just keeps going with them. They're really fascinating in terms of what the AI would want to do in the real world.
Nick, number 5.
I like the idea of having a real robot like in Robot and Frank. I'd have to pick number 5.
Yeah, it'd be great at parties, wouldn't he? Serving drinks, dancing, cocktail, all those kind of things. And anybody want to mention their favorite fictional robot not in the 3 this evening? We've already had Marvin suggested from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Probably. Go on, Garry.
Well, I was going to say the robot from Automata. I can't remember her name now. Is it Chloe or Cleo or something like that? I can't remember her name. But yes. Sorry?
I know, sorry, I was going to say there are so many robots to pick from. I could pick a random one and go, the robot from Lost in Space.
It was also
B9.
Robbie in,
B9 was the robot in Lost in Space. It was not Robbie. Because that was Danger Will Robinson Danger, just because I like that robot. I don't know why as a kid.
Thank you. Right, next month, our Exaflicks takes place on the 23rd of June. And if you're a certain person called Alan, celebrates that birthday, not this Alan, another Alan, very important to computer scientists, and we'll be reviewing titles related to the great man himself, AMT, Alan Turing. So we'll see you next month. Thank you very much. We're going to end the stream now. Please do give some feedback. There's a form you can fill in to ask a couple of simple questions. And if you've got a great suggestion for the future, you'd like to join our panel, please let us know. So we stop the live